Tim Panagos, welcome to the podcast.
Robby, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. So first of all, where are you at right now?
I am just north of Boston, Massachusetts.
Nice. In the forest. That's a real background, correct?
I got some trees around me. Yeah, I'm
Got trees around you.
fortunate enough to have some woods. Yeah.
Nice. So you are the CTO of a Internet of Things organization. And I was doing some research on your company, Microshare. It seems like you literally had a huge, never-ending list of use cases. So everything IoT related. Let me see. Environment monitoring, predictive cleaning, maintenance, contact tracing. So you have some COVID sort of use cases in there. And yeah, everything that falls under smart facilities and IoT. So you're an IoT guy today. And so I obviously want to pick your brain about things like digital twins, IoT security, some of the conversations you have with your customers, and something that I've been especially interested in lately is privacy and IoT.
Sounds great.
So that'll be fun. But before we get to that, tell us who the man in the forest is.
Yeah, so co-founder, chief technology officer, so I look after tech strategy, all the engineering. It really started with this idea that we wanted to democratize some of the cool technologies that really big companies were using, so that more people could take advantage of the idea that you can run your business with data. And so, the insights that generate that, allowing you to do better decisioning at scale. And one of the things we saw along the way was that there were some core problems that just had to be solved better. Privacy was one of the big ones. Or to say more generally, maybe the way the security community is familiar, data governance is a really big deal. And one of the things that we saw was that people were thinking about data governance as an afterthought, not as a fundamental tenet of how you architect a data-based system. And I'm sure security guys will be quite familiar with security as an afterthought, right? So, so we wanted to build in right from the get-go this idea that there's got to be an engine that makes better decisions about what data can be used for what, and then layer on top of that then the use cases. Rather than privacy as an afterthought, privacy as the first thought, and that's the door we walked through. And for the last 4 years, it's been really about narrowing in on IoT. Finding real quality use cases to deliver some good insights.
Yeah, cool. And you said 4 years ago. So back when I started with security, IoT was definitely like, I want to say a buzzword. Everybody was talking about it. Nobody really knew. It was something cool to talk about because it was new, right? But now today, these things are everywhere. You know what? I just want to skip to that. I think my most interesting point is the privacy aspect of it, right? Sure. And I don't have I don't really have any concrete questions for you, but every time I walk past a meeting room here in Mnemonic, and there's a lot of places, right? I can just see that there's cameras watching me, right? I sit in a room and I look at the screen. I'm not having a meeting. I'm just sitting in the room because meeting rooms are better than my desk sometimes. Right. And there's a camera watching me, right? And I always just think, not always, but I have thought like many times, like I don't like that thing's watching me, right? So privacy and IoT. What do you think of when you live and breathe this sort of IoT world, right?
Sure.
What do you think about that aspect these days?
Before I dig into that, can I set the stage a little bit for listeners?
Go ahead, because I did not make it easy for you at all.
No, and you shouldn't. I want to get into it. IoT is a pretty broad term, right? And like you said, very much a buzz cycle term over the last 10 years. You've seen some mini booms, some major booms, and some busts around IoT. But it's a huge umbrella term, right? And it encompasses everything from smart refrigerators to wireless devices that you might attach to the neck of your dog to know where your dog is at, right? So there's a huge broad range. Actually, the smart fridge is probably the middle of the range. You go up into what you'd call OT, operational technology. Measuring the performance of nuclear power plants and hydraulics. Yeah, exactly. And, so there's a massive range. And, cameras is somewhere in the middle there, generally attached, for security or something like that. But, when someone comes to me and says, "Oh, I'm in IoT," I say, "Well, that doesn't tell me anything. You got to what do you mean? What do you mean by IoT? Where are you really living?" Because obviously within that broad range, particularly from a security, a privacy, a data perspective, there's a tremendous amount of breadth there that impacts whether you're worried about privacy, whether you're worried about security, and maybe how worried you should be, right? So I want to set that stage so that now we can kind of dig in a little bit and talk, because obviously your nuclear power plant has security needs that far exceed the temperature sensor that I've got glued to my wall here that looks like this. They're very different concerns, right? Yeah, so let's dig into privacy a little bit from there. If we're talking about, the sort of workday kind of things that you're going to run into as a citizen, right? Employee, a customer, just somebody walking around, assuming you're not in a nuclear power plant. Then you're going to run into these kind of things that have both kind of dumb devices, right? You're always temperature monitors and things like that are around. This is an example. Probably you will have seen things like this. This is an infrared sensor. Could think of that as a camera since it detects light, but it's pretty stupid. It knows heat in front of me or not heat in front of me. Then you get into audio, like your Alexas and your smartphone listening to you. You get into video, like you said, security cameras, this webcam that we're both staring into. What, as an IoT kind of insider, I guess, the debate about online privacy, the behaviors that people are collecting and trafficking in around online behaviors pales in comparison to what actually can be known and is known about physical movements through the IoT space, right? Measurements of the real world. And I think that I am probably a threat to privacy, but I'm also a privacy advocate in that I see both sides of that problem, right? And I think we have to address both sides. We can't address one or the other. But, online, it might be hard, but I do have the choice to turn my computer off. I do have the choice to leave my phone at home, and I can walk out into those woods, and nobody's tracking my offline behaviors. Google doesn't know that I'm back there, right? If I choose, right? But I don't know for sure that my neighbor doesn't have a camera that can see me through the woods, or a microphone that's hooked up that could be picking up the leaves crunching back there. That's a little bit harder because it moves beyond our personal sphere, right? And it's the things in our environment that might be recording us. And, if you see the blinking lights and funny things stuck in your conference room that you're talking about, Robby, at least you're aware that those things are there. You might not know who's on the other end or even what they're actually receiving, but they're there. But think of, other environments. You're walking down a city street and you're passing ATMs. All those have cameras on them. You got traffic cameras. You've got people's cell phones that are listening, that are walking past you. It's pretty hard to not interact with an IoT world unless you're really deeply in the woods. And how many of us really want to resort to complete off-grid just to not be on someone's camera? So I think it is very, very worthy of concern, because at the end of the day, there is an individual freedom at stake for the information we're giving up that way.
And we don't really have a choice of that anymore, right? Like if I walk into a shopping center, all these devices everywhere, it's not like I can opt out of that.
Yeah, what's interesting, like you see GDPR for sure in Europe, and there's legislation that's mirroring that in many states already in the US and around the world, really does orient itself to this online behavior tracking, right? Where it's possible for you to get a pop-up that says, do you consent for this intent? You can click a box or push a button and make you aware, and that's one of the things that GDPR does. But how do you do that when you're walking around the street, right? You don't have that same awareness. You don't have that same opportunity. And I think as I think GDPR is written pretty broadly to include things like IoT. It doesn't exclude this kind of data. But when you really look at it, how do you operationalize that? How would you make a consent for a consumer because their face got picked up while they were walking past an ATM, maybe not even using the ATM, just strolling. Gets obviously a lot more complex because the contract with the consumer, with the individuals, is blurred, if there is one at all. So yeah, it gets tricky, right? And those that live in the Western world, I think, have some expectations of liberal freedoms, right? That we're not going to be subject to authoritarianism, but we're flirting with that. But there are parts of the world where they just don't have that same expectation. They can't have that same. Their government is watching them, and so I do think as humans we need to worry about that. I think we really do.
So if I understand you correctly, there's as people, there's not really, unless we want to move countries, right, and live in a different country living now, we can't really do much about it. Like there's IoT devices around us, and they're providing lots of value both to us as citizens and to the organizations that are putting them up there. But so rephrased, we can't really do too much about it, but the companies that buy those IoT devices and install them, they're the ones that have the responsibility to sort of take care of privacy for us.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think to say it more broadly, we have to have a societal contract that all participants can buy into, whether that's legislative or something else. I kind of prefer the non-legislative because I think that regulations are just things that lawyers get paid to circumvent, right? A social contract of some form, I think, is necessary, and there's certainly legal ways to bulwark that. But ultimately, I think as consumers, we need to get more aware. As participants in a company, we need to be more aware and just begin to demand. And then you already see this very much happening. You see it publicized around employees leaving Google and protesting. And, so there is some employee activism around that. But we all have a stake in ensuring that this doesn't go too far because it's, my father's generation certainly dealt with some very extreme authoritarianism, and data was the form of things that were written on paper. And if that were ever to reoccur with the power of what's known digitally, even historically, even if not currently, it just the downside is it's potentially shocking, right? I didn't really want to talk about it. It's really extreme. So we need to make sure that we can put some underpinnings in place, both that protect us from that authoritarianism, but also establish that social contract. But in order to establish a social contract, we also need the technology underneath that would enforce a social contract in the first place. And that's really where what the technology that we put together at Microshare early on was intended to be. And I'm not saying this is the only way to handle it, but the way that I thought about it was from first principles. Any kind of data in the modern world has to be thought of as having more than one owner. And the simplest kind of relationship is the buy and about, right? So I'm the buy, I own the camera, so I'm recording your image, but it's your image, so it's about you. We should both have an ownership stake in that piece of data, right? That image, that frame of the camera or frames of the video that have you. It shouldn't just be mine as the camera owner, because now, it's my data, it's my camera, I can do with it as I please. We have to have the ability to say, well, this belongs to Tim and to Robby. And what does it mean to belong? What does it mean to be an owner? Well, ultimately, what you care about is how you dispose of any asset that belongs to you, right? So if data is an asset that you can own, then you can make decisions about, well, I'm going to destroy it. I don't want this asset around, or I will loan it to this person, but only for 2 days and only for this reason, right? You just think about it as analogously, how would I loan my car, right? The car's my asset. I can sell it. I can blow it up if I want to. Well, maybe not, but I could dispose of it somehow. I could loan it to a buddy, but if if my buddy wanted to drive to Mexico, I'd say, no, I'm not loaning my car to you to drive to Mexico, right? You want to go to the store, you can, right? So you can put terms and conditions, in other words, around that. And I think that's exactly the same model we need to have around data, is to be able to ascribe the ownership of your video image to you, and then you should be able to have your policy set to say, here's what you're allowed to use my image for and what you're not allowed to use it. Maybe for safety, but not for marketing. Maybe for sales, but not for HR. You can begin to kind of break down the intents in a very similar way that you do with online behaviors. What's going to happen to that image? Who's going to see it? Can you sell it? Can you share it? What are the third-party relationships? At the end of the day, that's why we're called microshare, is those decisions have to be made at the micro level, right? At the frame level of an image, the byte level of a sensor, and have to be made in real time. And it's really ultimately, when you think about what you really want as an owner, you want to control who gets to see your data, who it's shared with, right? Because you don't care that you see your own data, that's fine. It's really who else gets to see it and for what intent. So that's, I think, for first principles, you have to have a system that will keep track of multiple owners. And just two owners is the simplest of multi-owners, right? You get into environments like real estate, where we do most of our work. There's a lot of concentric rings of involved parties. In fact, I think that's why real estate's such a good market for us, because it's an ecosystem, and it's a complex ecosystem where you've got the building owners, the company tenants, you've got the employees of the company, you've got the customers of the company, you've got cleaning staff, you've got maintenance guys, you've got firefighters who might come into that building because it's in a jurisdiction. You think about all of that. There are times when the sensors from that built space are applicable to all of those constituents. And at one point in time, you say, well, who owns the data? Who owns my occupancy data? Who owns the fire alarm data? Who owns the temperature data? And when you start stitching it together, there's a lot of things to orchestrate there, right? And ultimately, that's kind of what our system was built to do, is to collect that data, normalize it, make it useful, generate insights, but underneath it, keep track of that, of what the rules are about how that orchestration of data exchange, the governance, in other words, happens in an ecosystem like that.
That's really interesting. I just had an episode with the global head of security strategy for Checkpoint, and he was also a delegate on the World Economic Forum's I forgot what they called it, Data Intermediary Committee or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make some sort of platform so Robby can run around and say, give entities or businesses or give people my data, give them my consent to use my data. And that's very interesting what you said about, you have the buyer, which would in this case probably be one of your customers, and then you have the data owner, or me walking by the camera.
Yeah.
But so I'm guessing you're or I know I'm pretty sure that your main focus is the buyer then, right?
Well, it has to be, because they're the ones who spend the money to do it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the reality. It has to start with somebody, and to your point, you do have to start with trusting the owner of the camera to put in some kind of infrastructure that would allow the data from the camera to be respected. And I mean, there's no doubt that isn't happening today or tomorrow, right? It's a kind of a long game we're trying to play here, because there are a lot of sensors in the world, and they're mostly connected to stupid networks with stupid software. The reality is most of the security cameras you're walking by are going to a VCR still with a loop, and it races itself every 8 hours or something like that, right? So that's the reality. Is that IoT? Well, you got to squunch your head up quite a bit to call that IoT. So there's a big range of sophistication there, and there's a big range of intents and incentives. And that's where, you need something like the World Economic Forum to begin to chip away. Because some of these incentives are simple. I'm just trying to make sure that nobody's stealing the money out of the ATM. Or that's my only intent. Versus, hey, I'm looking to know what the foot traffic is on this street, and I'm looking to see if there's anybody with an outstanding arrest warrant. with facial recognition.
Right.
Well, shit. Well, that could be the very same camera.
Difference, yeah.
That's very different intents, right? Very, very different. So yeah, we do have to parse that apart, but it does start with, I think, the consumers insisting that the people who deploy sensors into their environment have an answer to some of these problems and questions, and even if that's not regulatory, because my worry about regulation is, a lot of the heat has been pushed onto corporations, but I think a lot of the risk is with governments. So if governments are writing the regulation and enforcing the regulation, who's regulating them is my worry. You can regulate companies, all right, that's a start, but regulating the regulators, that's a little trickier. But anyway, I think all of that is necessary. But yeah, it does start with the people wanting to do the right thing in their data collection. And I think things like GDPR, although they're fairly broad, I think just hints at the idea that maybe I ought to be thinking about this less as an afterthought, maybe is something that we want to bake in. And if I'm honest, Robby, my customers don't come to me saying, I'm really looking for a privacy-aware sharing solution, right? That's not what they say. I'm looking for a way to make better decisions about whether to clean my bathrooms or not, right? So the sharing stuff really is, I've put it in there believing that eventually
one day
it will pop up and they'll be like, shit, my tenant won't take the lease because I've got too many blinking lights in the conference room. And I can be like, I got you, dog. We've thought this through. Here's how you give them co-ownership of that data. Here's how they can set their own rules. Here's how they can give their employees real-time views into what's being recorded about them. One of the things we do is when we put our devices in a building, and you'll have a barcode. If you scan this barcode, it will tell you exactly what this device is, what it's measuring right now, and give you the opportunity to say, I want to own that data.
So it's transparent in some way, shape, or form for the person exposed to it.
Yeah. So it's it's not great, it's not perfect, but it is a way of basically giving you that pop-up experience that you get on a website and say, hey, you're in this conference room, you're curious about this thing, let me tell you what it is, let me show you what it knows, and then if you choose to exert some control over it, you could. And the reality is most people aren't going to want to fiddle with knobs and dials, with all the data that flows through. I mean, that could be a full-time job. But I think for the most part, it's radical transparency is where it starts, right? Because evil stuff happens in the darkness. It's a lot harder to get away with shenanigans in the light, and I think that's step one. Awareness and visibility, and then we can really have some more substantive conversations about what real governance looks like at that kind of scale.
Yeah. Well, awesome. It sounds like you use security as a business enabler. Yes.
I think that's right.
Perfect.
I think that's right, Robby. I think that's right. Now, am I successful using it as a business enabler? Not sure.
But hey, you're here today, so must be doing something right.
It is. Yeah, for sure.
So you just showed me a device. So you're not only controlling like the platform that all the data goes into, because I know there's a bunch of infrastructure that supports that. I have some other customers in mnemonic that work with that sort of stuff. But the device itself. So you have to distinguish those two, right? You have the device itself and you have like the platform. What are your customers?
Yeah, that's quite
I'll use an example. That whole, what was it called? Verkada? You heard about that, right? This whole Verkada security system. Like, do you ever go through like a threat modeling process with your potential clients?
Very rarely. One of the things that we have chosen to do, and it's really a cop-out, to be frank, is we have chosen probably, as I set the stage for IoT, we've chosen the least risky side of IoT. And it is really almost purely sensing. And these are long-range, battery-powered, typically, sensing devices. No IP connectivity, so no TCP/IP stack on these devices. These use a proprietary wireless technology called LoRaWAN. And we deploy the routers. They're called gateways in this case, and they look just like a Wi-Fi router. Here's one, looking just like a Wi-Fi router. We put these into an office, and you can cover a very large building with two of these. These guys talk wirelessly to this guy, and these guys usually have a SIM card in them that sends the data to the cloud. No overlap with the network of the company that this is installed in. So keeping the network separated means that, if you could hack this, there's no IP, so you're not telnetting from this into someplace else. There's no shush terminal on this thing. And even if you could communicate, you can communicate to this thing, but this thing's not hooked to your password databases, your transactional data stores. It's not on the same network at all. And that helps us in a lot of ways to say, let me mitigate the risk by not intertwining your networks. And this is one of the things, right? Is that Internet of Things? Is this on the internet? No, not really. So does this count? Well, we could argue about how important the internet is versus the things part, but not having things literally on TCP/IP kind of defrays some of that risk, right? It's a cop-out, right? Doesn't mean it's not an attack surface, but it's a separate attack surface that kind of limits the scope, the risk profile of these kind of devices. Now, of course, like I said, not all IoT devices fit that model. Plenty of these IoT devices, you put a Nest thermostat up, it attaches to your Wi-Fi. And there are building systems that are in your office building that connect to your office networks, right, by Ethernet or Wi-Fi often. So there is an overlap between those devices and the corporate networks potentially. So you do have to think about these as servers essentially, or clients. Yeah. So you have to worry about that, firewalling and permissioning and all that stuff, because they do present attack surfaces that most people wouldn't think about. So I think there's some tension there, right, in those areas. And I think the cop-out that we've chosen is like, look, let's just keep it separated for now. So you might compromise this device, but even most of these devices don't have any actuation, because that's the other thing to think about. Like, what's the greatest risk? Is it that what the temperature is in my conference room? I'm not sure I care that a hacker knows what temperature it is in my conference room, but if they could change the temperature,
then it's
yeah. Well, okay. Well, now there's some risk, right? So mostly we just stay on the sensing side versus the actuation side. Although we're entering into the actuation side a little bit. So we try to keep those things separated. So sensing about the space versus changing the dynamics of the physical space, right? Which is really where OT truly becomes in, right? It's one thing to know how hot your nuclear reactor is, another thing to change.
Right.
Right. So in some ways, we're starting with that lower risk so that we can, really master the idea that the data itself is valuable, even if you have to send a human to go twist the thermostat. Knowing that it should be hotter, colder, or whatever is step one. Step two then is changing the physical space, right? So we're hoping to kind of notch up what we're getting involved with, and as the device manufacturers, as the specification providers get more sophisticated about securing these more complex use cases, we can draft along with the industry and not have to strong arm it all right now. And there's, you call this low-hanging fruit, right? There's plenty of value in just sensing, and you don't need. I guess the other thing that goes along with that is these aren't cameras; they're not audio devices, because the bandwidth on this proprietary network is vanishingly small. The typical payload is something like 25 bytes. So you're not pushing audio, you're not pushing video this way. Because obviously those are, I think from a human perspective, we'd say video is a different level than temperature, right? I'm not even sure I really care if people know what the temperature of my forehead is, although obviously there's some health implications of that. But if you know exactly what I'm doing, you can watch me do it. All of a sudden, that's pretty creepy, right? So I think that low bandwidth is also an aspect of this, to say, there's only so much information that could be collected from these things, so it's lower risk.
I would assume that you probably would have a lot lower chance of having to speak with the security guy and for one of your potential clients if it wasn't touching their network, right? If it was just like on some other thing, then security doesn't need, whoever's buying it doesn't need to talk to security maybe. Is that true? Is that kind of how it works out?
I encourage people not to not talk to security. But what we're trying to do, I think, really quickly is educate the security teams and then put them at ease. That, because there's a lot of, I think, unknowns, right? There's known unknowns and unknown unknowns in the IoT space. And it's not that I won't explore that with IoT groups, with security groups rather, but, I also really can't afford them to block any innovation, right?
Yeah.
So as a business person now, not as a technologist or, security guy or whatever, as an entrepreneur, I got to be able to do business, guys. So if you're just going to throw at me all these, security requirements that actually don't matter, it's not gonna fly. You only keep things like this out for so long. What I'd rather do is engage in a high quality conversation with the security team, educate them, allow them to understand what the risks are, and let's address the real risks, the actual risks collectively. Because I learn stuff from our customers and their security teams all the time. It isn't a well-established area, right? It hasn't been done for 20 years, so these things are evolving, and so I really want the active participation of those security teams. But at the end of the day, most of them say, "Oh, now that I understand what you're up to, I got bigger problems."
Right. Yeah. I catch your drift there. I've seen security people do sometimes have a tendency to make things secure just to be secure and don't really see the big picture sometimes, I guess.
Well, it's the job and it's the imperative, right? I mean, I see that too because I've got to secure my own stuff, right? I spend a lot of time in cybersecurity myself. I know the tension, I get it, and I hate being Dr. No at the end of the day, but I know the tension. We're always asked to do more by people who don't understand the implications of the questions they're asking, the things they're trying to do, and there's only so many hours in a day. There's only so many watts of worry that you can output into the world, right?
Yeah, right.
So yeah, we get that. And I think what's really important is I don't really want to recreate the Dropbox problem, but in the OT/IT world. And I'm sure you guys know the Dropbox problem, right? It's like I didn't ask IT, I just went and did my thing, and I'm loading my files out into the world. The same thing can be done with IoT. You can buy these things off the shelf. Most people are clever enough to connect them to their cellular hotspot, so they don't even have to ask you for. It's like this stuff is going to happen. Let's try to do it right, but let's also not bog it down so that business can't do what they need to do because they will circumvent. Right? That's the Dropbox problem. If you make it too hard, they'll go figure it out and they'll cut you out. So I just find that always a balance.
Yeah, I just came to the realization that as soon as you touch a network, then security gets involved. If that device has to go into mnemonic as Wi-Fi, then somebody cares. If it's not a part of my network, then my ethics officer would care or should care. But right.
Right.
So then okay.
I think that's interesting perspective. That's right. Ethics versus security. Where's the line there? Where's privacy fall? Certainly, security guys are worried about privacy, but this kind of privacy maybe transcends what your typical CISO can literally be worried about, right?
Yeah, and that's a whole other discussion for itself whether CISO should have ethics responsibility. I kind of believe that actually, but that's that is a different podcast.
For sure.
2 more questions for you, and to see where we've Anyway, digital twins.
Yeah.
Say you build some, in my head, I have no idea, but a digital twin is just like a digital recreation of something that's physical to be able to do, predictive stuff, try things, see if that'll work, see if it won't work, whatever.
Yeah.
Have you ever sort of incorporated you know what a honeypot is?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, have you ever incorporated that sort of honeypot into a digital twin just to see? I'm just literally asking you out of curiosity.
Never have. It's an interesting idea, right? I mean, create a ghost building that looks like it's full of gold vaults or something, right?
For deception, I don't know what you get out of that, but
it's an interesting idea. But for your listeners, I think a digital twin. I think the simplest way to think about it is it's a model that you stick data onto, right? It's something that helps you really kind of visualize, contextualize the digital information with a physical reference. And digital twins really came, and it's still very heavily used sort of in manufacturing, particularly with complex things like automobiles, where, at design time, you've got this digital representation of your automobile you're designing, and you want to model the complex systems of how they're interacting before you make them physical. And then as you make them physical, reflect that back into the design environment. And that's not terribly different than what we're doing in buildings, but sort of mostly what we do is post design, right? Building's already built, and then we come along sometimes 100 years after the building was built, right? We're dealing with all kinds of new and old spaces, come up and stick these things all over the place, and all of a sudden I'm getting temperature data, and I could output that into a spreadsheet for you, which is business data level 1, right? Most people look at that spreadsheet and are like, oh, right, there's 50 columns and 10 million rows. What the hell am I going to do with this spreadsheet? Well, it's not the way that people generally orient themselves to their world. It's certainly not how guys who manage space think about their world. They don't manage by spreadsheets typically. So we need to give them a picture that looks like the physical, where they can look and say, oh, I understand that's a conference room.
Reference point.
I'm seeing the air quality and the occupancy and the temperature, humidity, HVAC performance of that space. And they're relating to it like they would the physical world, right? It's a place I can go and I could look around. And I think, the AR, augmented reality kind of aspect is of what you should picture. It's not the actuality. I'd like to build some AR tools, but, imagine walking into a conference room, being able to look at the blinking lights that are around and have the data that it's collected available to you in that way. So really, it's that digital twin that allows people to navigate and create the context of all this data we're creating, because that's kind of what matters, right? So it's the match of physical. At a trivial level, you could just think about as metadata, right? It's tagged. We're tagging the data we get in, and the tags happen to relate to a physical thing. But digital twins could be products, they could be buildings, they could be people, right?
Yeah.
So it's anything that's in the world that we want to begin to build high resolution images of in the digital space, and how to get back and forth between those two things. That's what it's do.
We have digital twins. There's a digital twin of me and there's a digital twin of you. It's just owned by Facebook or Google or probably a million digital twins
Absolutely
of us.
right. They typically don't use that word, but that's exactly what it is, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
And what's super creepy about it, and you're seeing a lot of the backlash about it, is they're using that digital twin to predict, and then also potentially change our behaviors. Right? So yeah, okay, that's pretty fucking creepy.
Very creepy.
So I'd rather apply that to a building and say that I can predict and then impact the behavior of a building. A lot less creepy, and from a societal value perspective, doing things like saving energy, ensuring that spaces are safer. You mentioned the COVID context. We've done a lot of things in quarantine. We're doing even more as people return back to work in their typical spaces, with health, well-being, safety, air quality, cleaning, cleanliness. All of that is goodness about, can I measure the space? Can I picture how it impacts the people? And can I improve that space to improve those dimensions? A lot less creepy if it's that, inanimate object versus the animate objects that we are as well. But I think quite right, what you point out, Robby, is the data, a random unsigned integer that I get out of the air that might be a occupancy sense, it might be a temperature. Is that interesting? I'm not sure anybody would really care that somebody sniffed that out and figured out this might be a temperature of an inside space. Knowing what that space is, takes that data up a notch, right? The sensor doesn't know where it is. It has no idea. There's no location chip in this. It just knows, hey, wherever I am, whatever I am, here's a temperature reading. Once you begin to mate that with the physical insight, you're saying, oh, well, this is the temperature of the server room. Well, okay, well, now that starts to get interesting. It starts to get riskier. It's better for prediction, but it's also creates an attack surface. So I do think you're right in pointing out, the digital twin turns this data into information, maybe, and that's where it gets kind of interesting from a security perspective.
And I have one last little example of exactly what you just said, like these COVID tracking apps, right? Or Norway has its own, it's called Smittestop. And that basically, I have it, right? It just tracks you wherever you are. And if you get within X amount of meters between somebody that has it, you'll get a message eventually. Yeah. That's the whole thought of it, right? And I know somebody, I know, and this is probably not, this is definitely something that doesn't happen in Norway, it happens everywhere. You also mentioned what's in it for me, right? I have that app. I have it on right now. But I do know somebody that like turned it off once they were in quarantine.
Yeah.
Because they started, thinking like, okay, the rules change all the time. I'm in quarantine. Can I go to the store? Can I go, I need food. Turn it off, because when they go to the store, maybe they're breaking a rule. So, like you said, like earlier, me standing in a store, it's one thing. It's harmless, right?
Yeah.
But if me standing in a store while I'm in quarantine, versus me standing in a store where I actually have COVID or something, right? Like there is that context right there. The data is one thing, but the context and information that you can do with the data becomes a whole nother animal once you start putting more layers.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think, the worry that everybody should have is, even if today the data is innocuous, will it always be? Because it doesn't go away, right? You can't presume it goes away at least. So the idea that you were measured in that store today may have no impact, but 20 years from
when
now,
I'm running for president a couple of years from now, right?
well, hey, which store were you in? What happened to that store later? It's becomes almost impossible to predict the implications of our physical actions in that way. Even if you knew you were violating a law today, well, that's one thing. What if a law comes into act, 5 years from now, and you were retroactively in violation of that? Well, where's the safe space there, man? I don't know. It gets pretty interesting from that perspective. But what's in it for you is a great question, right? So those are the downsides. I think visibility and control of the data takes the edge off a lot of that downside. But what's in it for you, I think, ultimately, is that we need to put the power of these tools back into the people's hands. So it's about empowering individuals. The analogy I like to use, I don't know if you drive to work at all, but those that do might know the Waze app.
Of course.
You might have your smartphone, right, helping you navigate, pick the least busy route, basically get from point A to point B fastest. It's a good example of a consumer-oriented app that crunches a tremendous amount of information from a lot of different data sources, including recording data from the people who are using the app. It puts a bunch of complex information into a very simple value-add experience for the end user, and they get a lot of value because they save life, right? Saving life by saving traffic, and getting from point A to point B faster really is a benefit. If we could take that Waze app and then add to it, I'm going to work because I want to interact with Robby, and I want to do it in the least risky scenario, and the most productive scenario is the other way to think about it. So what if I also had building information and the information from your schedule into the Waze app that would not only tell me how to get there, but what day should I go, what time should I go, where should I go? Because if we don't have an office anymore, it's a dynamically scheduled coffee room in the spot where the time between us is coordinated. I mean, you could do that with your coworkers and friends if you spent a lot of time going back and forth. Show up on Tuesday, but if you could weave all this data together, I think, yes, we could improve the buildings. Yes, we could improve safety. But I think we could weave those things together in a way that really improved your life as an individual by allowing you to collaborate, allowing you to optimize your safe space. You don't want to be in a conference room 5 minutes after 50 people just left. You didn't know 50 people. You didn't contact those 50 people. They didn't show up on your app probably. But you're breathing the same air they all breathe. You all breathed, right? And all of these sensors can make that invisible activity visible. And if we figure out how to put that into the right format, I think it is about employee experience. I think it's about customer experience, and I think there's real value to that. But it's not worth giving up our civil liberties for sure. So we need to mediate that.
It's all dependent on trust as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that's right. You have to trust people for the most part to behave. And my experience has been visibility, transparency is the key to trust, right?
Yep. Well, hopefully the World Economic Forum and their task force with Eddie Doyle in there, hopefully they, make something, create something up for us to look at, and it's good. And thankfully you have your platform there. It's already light years ahead of the others and ready to be data transparent. And I think we have
come out with it, let's talk about it more, right?
Cool, exactly. Well, Mr. Panagos, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to Microshare for all the great things you guys are doing there, and wish you the best. And hopefully we'll talk soon.
Thanks much, Robby.
Have a good one. Take care.
Cheers.